to you all. My name is Trebilco and I teach in the Department of Theology and Religion here at the university, and it's a great privilege to welcome you all to this event. This event is hosted by the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, which has been part of the university since 2009. A sign-up sheet is going around. If you don't receive regular emails from the Centre, please do add your name so we can inform you of future events. The Centre for Theology and Public Issues has a particular remit to promote informed and serious debate around issues which are of public concern. You could certainly say that tonight we are considering one such topic. End-of-life issues tend to bring to the fore our deeply held convictions about life and about death, and about who has ultimate control over them. So it's wholly appropriate that this evening's meeting should be hosted by a centre which aims to bring a theological perspective to bear on public issues. That being said, it's not a condition of our panellists being here that they engage in theological arguments as such. Rather, we want them to share with us their own point of view, and in so doing help us to think through some of the key questions involved in this important but far from straightforward issue. The title of this event really speaks for itself: a conversation we need to have. Cases like the one involving one of our panellists, Professor Davison, keep the issue of assisted suicide and euthanasia before us. But we can't change legislation on the basis of a few events. We need informed and serious debate, an opportunity to consider all of the angles and implications. This then is one such opportunity for us. A word about how the evening will proceed. First, we'll hear a paper from Thomas Noakes-Duncan, who had a summer scholarship this year in the Department of Theology and Religion, researching how the debate on euthanasia and assisted suicide has been conducted here in New Zealand over the past decade or two. Tom has distilled his findings into a 20-minute paper, and I'll invite him to deliver that in a minute. Then we'll hear responses from our four panellists: Professor Davison, the Honourable Marion Street, Professor Gillett and John Kleinsman. Each is being firmly held to a 10-minute limit. Then we'll have a brief comment from Associate Professor Colin Gavaghan. Then there'll be an opportunity for you to raise questions for our panellists and for us to enter into discussion. So without further ado, I'll now call on Tom Noakes-Duncan. Tom is currently a PhD student in our department, and as I said, he had a summer scholarship to look into these issues. Please welcome Tom.
Good evening. As Paul mentioned, what I will be presenting tonight is a very condensed and highly edited version of my research on this topic. I am very grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this very important and hopefully illuminating event. But if anyone is interested in seeing my fuller research on this topic, then please do grab me afterwards. While reflection on medical ethics originated many centuries before Christ, early rabbinic and Christian teachings have influenced its modern development. Inspired by the ministry of Jesus the Healer, Christians have brought their narrative to bear on the purpose and goals of medicine. For example, suffering, which within the Greco-Roman worldview was regarded as a lack of virtue or honour, or within Jewish belief as the consequence of sinful behaviour, was regarded by St. Paul as universally experienced, a consequence of living within the fallen creation. Medicine was thus not seen as a battle to overcome suffering and secure an honourable death. Rather, its purpose was to restore the sufferer to health and to the community. In recent decades, reflection on medical ethics has increasingly abandoned the interwoven traditions of medicine and Christianity, preferring instead the instrumental logic of Mill, Rawls and Hume. The new attitude is reflected by the writer in the Dominion Post, who recently argued, "Religion has no place in our society any longer. Why should Christians and any other groups with vested interest have any say on voluntary euthanasia? Let New Zealanders decide." While we might wonder who New Zealanders are in this context, the appeal for public debate to be conducted insulated from communities of religious conviction, is not unfamiliar in our secular society. Yet if we were to embody a commitment to civil exchanges among traditions, then we would discover that the Christian narrative has much relevance to contribute to public debates such as these. In this brief paper, I want to highlight what is at stake in the call for a change in the law here in New Zealand. Drawing upon my interviews with key figures engaging publicly on this issue, I first identified 3 appeals that support the case for change: compassion, dignity or autonomy, and secularism. And then I will explore the assumptions that appear to underpin these appeals, considering what they might say about our society's attitude towards the vulnerable and dying. So first, the appeal from compassion. For many, voluntary euthanasia belongs in the category of ethical issues which define what it means to be humane. Professor Davison told the media last year, quote, "I did the compassionate thing by helping my mother to her death. I believe any humane person would have done the same thing." Or again, "If I committed a crime, it was a crime of compassion." To be humane, compassion requires that we accept voluntary euthanasia. Professor Davison's plea for compassion attracted much sympathy. Here is one letter to the ODT. "What sort of a sick medieval society do we live in that we have to pursue a man through the so-called justice system because, acting out of love and compassion, he assists in ending the misery of his terminally ill mother? Why should anyone have to suffer extremely and needlessly to justify the personal prejudices and religious superstitions of an uncaring public? People have the right to elect to die with dignity, and those that deny them this right are evil." Has the appeal to compassion arisen partly because the nature of our dying has changed? Medical interventions have meant that we now live longer, but sometimes to the point where death appears as a prolonged and agonising process from which we plead to be released. Standing at the bedside, our compassion begs us to respond. To tolerate the suffering because of a supposedly greater moral imperative or principle, like all killing is always wrong, feels like a betrayal of loyalty and affection to the one who is dying. We find moral systems grounded in principles or rules too abstract and too distant from the everyday experience of moral choices. Our emotions, feelings, and personal values often appear to be the best indicators of what is right and wrong. Stories like Professor Davison's prompt us to reflect upon the kind of society that we live in. What does it mean to safeguard the imperative to compassion when confronted with suffering? Do we have an inhumane medical practice that has usurped the natural process of death and instead practices what one commentator calls biological idolatry, making biological life an absolute value without respect for the concerns and suffering of the individual? Can we even talk of a natural death anymore? One Christian minister I interviewed said that he could no longer reassure a dying person that they will be all right because God is in control, as he believed that it is now the medical profession who sat in the place of dominance. The second appeal from autonomy. We have lost control of how we die. The suffering that comes with illness and dying so weakens our sense of integrity that we are compelled to honour that integrity by recognising our right to end our life. We must reassert our autonomy and shape a death of our own making. As the dictum puts it, my body, my choice. Thus, calls for voluntary euthanasia are framed as a demand for dignity in dying. Dignity being the need to control and manage our dying. If self-determination is the cornerstone of human existence, then voluntary euthanasia represents the last definitive step towards recovering it in the fullest individual sense. Voluntary euthanasia is, for some, a fundamental right. The Copernican revolution that led to man being the centre of the universe, with his reason being the basis for knowledge and enlightened values, has come to mean that the individual has assumed superiority over any collective notions of the good. Death on demand becomes a commodity to which we, as right-bearing individuals, should have access. If it poses a certain risk to others, that should not deter its being available. Christians and atheists both advocate for voluntary euthanasia on these secular liberal grounds. In the Christian case for voluntary euthanasia, Murray and Carley write that we believe very deeply that not only as a human right, but also as part of our Christian faith, that God gives each of us the choice of how we choose to live and how we would choose to die. God is the guarantor of individual rights, and this is the freedom to which Jesus Christ has called us. As the Reverend John Murray told me, to remove his right to end his life because it may have a corrupting influence on society is to deny the gospel. Yet the notion of collective assent cannot be entirely absent here. If a person's integrity is rooted in their being a self-determining agent, and this integrity can be so threatened by some forms of suffering, such that the only solution is to end their life, how can this then be translated into policy? Only as we collectively assent to the value judgment that some forms of suffering are so meaningless that they must be actively opposed. The third appeal for secularisation. The third underlying appeal for voluntary euthanasia can be attributed to the secularisation of bioethics, a development that has gained particular force since the 1970s. This development has radically altered our attitude to dying and the worldview that related God to human death. The relatively new field of bioethics sought to replace what it had inherited from the interwoven tradition of medicine and religious reflection with moral principles based on reason alone. Their application was increasingly set by narrow circumscribed quandaries, which then formed the basis of public policy. Bioethics and the idea of a good death was defined by the goal of maximising individual autonomy, which was celebrated over against the old authorities of priest, king, and the new figure of arbitrary dominance, the physician. Discussion about death and dying thus became increasingly specialised, technical, and privatised, with Christian input only tolerated when it adopted the language of rights, making it hard for it to say anything distinctive. Thus, an editorial in the Herald suggested that the Davison verdict was based on a black and white sense of right or wrong, not to mention a very hard heart. In a secular society, it continued, the discussion on the right of the terminally ill to end their own lives has progressed beyond religion and into areas of ethics, liberty, and human rights. Similarly, the press argued that advances in medical science have led to the widespread conviction that people should be allowed to exit the world at a time and means of their own choosing. Some will assert that only the Christian God has the right to terminate life, the press said, but while they may be right, they have no fiat to impose their views and suppress discussion of them. The secularisation of bioethics may be one reason why the debate over voluntary euthanasia appears so polarised. We must either be reasonable and progressive by advocating for personal choice, or irrational and antiquarian by seeking to protect a particular conception of human meaning. So let me now briefly explore the assumptions behind these arguments. First, compassion. In his recent study of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, Chris Marshall of Victoria University offers the following definition of compassion. An experience of emotional pain and moral concern occasioned by the awareness of and identification with another subject's suffering or unhappiness. Such vicarious suffering, Marshall argues, plays a critical role in guiding moral discernment, creating moral community, and motivating moral performance. However, compassion does not make clear the kind of normative moral guidance that should follow from this emotion. Marshall would agree that compassion can involve the attempt to end or relieve a person's suffering, but not that every means to achieve that goal is legitimate, especially if that includes ending the life of the sufferer. The Good Samaritan parable suggests that compassion, far from being just an emotion, requires practical outworking, the doing of mercy, regardless of outcome. The question is whether in experiencing the compassion of vicarious suffering, it is morally justified to act on that emotion by assisting the sufferer to die, even when that person is a loved one. I want to raise three initial questions about such a justification, noting in passing that the world-class palliative care system that we do have in New Zealand means that no one has to die in physical pain. As one interviewee told me, people who want to take their lives generally do not have good enough hospice or palliative care. Quote, if people are in physical pain at the end of life, then the healthcare system has let them down. So my first question is this: does compassionate euthanasia place an unbalanced emphasis on emotion over reason? Our Western tradition wants a public sphere where reason alone governs our public deliberations, with emotions, like religion, relegated to the subjective world of the private. Yet is this relationship simply reversed in the case of compassionate euthanasia? By disengaging emotions from moral reasoning, will we end up actually distorting compassion? For some, compassion looks like this response to a Dominion Post opinion piece. I work with disabled children, some for which there is no hope. The parents are saddled with them until their old age. Euthanasia should be an option for the parents and their secular doctors to debate, all religious personnel and PC academics to be barred from the discussion. Compassion leads some to want to relieve parents of their emotional exhaustion by accelerating the death of their disabled children, and others to cherish the disabled as valuable members of the community. Without moral reasoning, an emotive ethic of compassion can give moral legitimacy to non-voluntary and involuntary euthanasia just because we experience that emotion. Second, where does compassionate solidarity fit in? Upholding the sufferer as a valued member of the community. Is it threatened or enhanced when we offer the possibility of an assisted suicide? Does telling a patient that their condition is too difficult for them and us to face reduce their suffering or contribute to it by reinforcing their plea for release by any means? Is society's duty to care for our elderly at risk when we present the option of voluntary euthanasia too quickly? Commentating on the increase in suicide among the elderly, Age Concern notes that one of the things older people worry about is social loneliness. How does an ethic of compassion address this need? In adopting voluntary euthanasia, can we avoid the danger of devaluing the elderly, placing them beyond the reach of our compassionate solidarity? Third, is compassionate euthanasia naive about the partiality of its scope? We feel the most intense compassion towards those we love, not those who are different. Yet the true test of compassion, as the case of the Samaritan demonstrates, is in fact how we feel towards the outsider. Will it not be those who are lonely who will be the most affected by the introduction of voluntary euthanasia? While a story like the Good Samaritan can highlight important issues around compassionate euthanasia, it is hardly informing our moral imagination today. Our media prefer sensationalist stories which capture our attention, leaving anti-euthanasia arguments often unheard. The New Zealand Voluntary Euthanasia Society told me that the media actually helps their cause, their membership usually rising after the reporting of a tragic story. Rod McLeod, the only palliative care professor in New Zealand, also notes the power of the media to influence public opinion. While New Zealand has one of the better palliative care systems in the world, McLeod says, the message we hear from the media is that people are dying in agony, pleading for life to end, which thus increases our anxiety about death. The experiences of those who opt for palliative care are seldom heard, while the idea that dying is an agonising and terrible process is continually reinforced. The second appeal from autonomy. Is voluntary euthanasia a simple issue of personal choice that need not affect anyone else? Is the exercise of choice or responsibility autonomous, or made within a network of relations? And if so, what effect would voluntary euthanasia have on this social network? If we are models for each other's lives, witnesses to the kind of life made possible by our practices, will accepting voluntary euthanasia produce a model for society that we do in fact want to endorse? Most people view suicide as a tragedy, whatever the circumstances. Yet though usually carried out in isolation, suicide has a profound social effect, including increasing the likelihood of subsequent suicides as others reach a similar point of despair. This is one reason why the law permits assault in order to prevent suicide. When the journalist Rosemary McLeod describes voluntary euthanasia as suicide with better manners, she asks whether it tacitly legitimates a way of coping with suffering which morally, medically, legally and socially accepts that death is sometimes the only way out. It also reinforces the view that our suffering is ours to bear alone. Would adopting voluntary euthanasia bring about a change in social values, as its assumptions about suffering and human worth become ingrained into our society? Might it eventually challenge assumptions about who we consider human? Was Barbara Sumner Bernstein, in her award-winning article in the New Zealand Herald in 2009, exaggerating when she described euthanasia as having the potential to become the ultimate solution to the problem of society's human burdens? As we face the financial responsibility of an increasingly elderly population, is it hyperbole to ask whether the right to die might one day become a duty to die? Would the voluntary nature of euthanasia be at risk as patients become subject to utilitarian calculations? Would life still be seen as a given, or would some have to justify their right to live? Provocative questions, but this is a social issue with consequences for us all. Canadian philosopher Anita Ho maintains that truly autonomous decisions are not possible when abstracted from the social context of a person's life. Even when safeguards are introduced that recognise a patient's competence to make a voluntary decision, people still opt to end their life not because it accords with their values, but because they recognise that no one wants to care for them or who cherishes their value. Free choice simply becomes choice within certain cultural frameworks. The appeal from secularism. If the secular turn in bioethical discourse has replaced distinctively religious notions of a common good, or telos, with the language of self-determination and universal rights, is it surprising that many consider the legalisation of euthanasia to be inevitable in a secular society? If death no longer holds a meaning that transcends the individual, what will stop it being controlled by a culture shaped by the value of autonomous self-determination? Daniel Callaghan, a highly respected bioethicist and not a religious believer, argues that secularism leaves us all too heavily dependent upon the law as the working source of morality, and bereft of the accumulated wisdom and knowledge which come from religion, such that we are now forced to pretend that we are not creatures both of particular moral communities and the more sprawling, incoherent general community that we celebrate as an expression of our pluralism. This raises the question whether discarding the moral traditions of religion will leave secular society still able to place substantial limits on medicine and ensure that physicians continue to view their vocation within the context of care and healing, given that the law can only tell physicians what they can't yet do, not what is commendable or right. Many people I interviewed working in end-of-life care now introduce spirituality as an alternative category to religion when discussing questions of meaning with patients and physicians. Yet is spirituality a concrete enough term to provide this sense of moral guidance to the provision of medicine? Some people I interviewed suggested that to protect us from a legitimised form of killing, we shall have to turn to the bureaucratic authority of the state. Only the authority that exists in the name of protecting us from each other can secure for us a peace that needs no recourse to religious convictions, which inevitably provoke conflict. In this vision, our salvation rests not upon God's valuation of the human life, nor upon the vision for humanity offered by Jesus the healer, but rather the state determines which life is valuable enough to protect. Yet surely, given the history of the nation-state over the past century, this vision should not only be a concern for the religious, but physicians and patients as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A New Zealander by birth and graduate of this university, Sean Davison is currently Professor in the Department of Biotechnology at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, where he specialises in research on forensic DNA analysis. Earlier this week, Professor Davison was released after serving a period of home detention for assisting the death of his mother, Patricia Elizabeth Davison, in October 2006. Originally charged with attempted murder, Professor Davison pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of counselling and procuring suicide and was ordered to serve 5 months home detention here in Dunedin. His actions first came to light when a manuscript copy of his book, Before We Say Goodbye, was leaked, revealing that at the request of his terminally ill mother, a medical doctor, he gave her crushed morphine tablets in a glass of water. Sean returns home to his wife and 2 children this weekend. We are very grateful to him for being willing to be with us during this somewhat traumatic week. Please join me in welcoming Professor Davison.
Thank you very much for that welcome. It is indeed a pleasure to be here, but an even greater pleasure to be a free man, I must say. Dunedin is very much in my heart. As the chairperson said, it's been a very traumatic and dramatic experience. My mother died here, I was arrested here, I stood trial for attempted murder here, and I served a 5-month house arrest sentence here. But I love Dunedin, I love the people, I love the culture, and I love the scenery. It will always be the home in my heart. A few days ago, I went out to Broad Bay. This is where my mother chose to spend the last 10 years of her life. She'd lived a very colourful life. She'd travelled the world, lived in many countries, and even as a family, we travelled together. But she chose to spend her final years in Broad Bay, one of the most picturesque areas in Dunedin, in Otago, a beautiful town, nestled in by the harbour. She had a house surrounded by her own wild garden, carefully planted but looking very wild. She had a large double glass window looking out over the harbour, and she had an archway built into her bedroom wall so she could view the harbour from her bedroom, from her bed. That stunning but peaceful view. And she had Truffle. Truffle was her fluffy black cat, and she commanded the house. Every time she appeared at the glass door, Mum would get up, open the door, in would come Truffle. That wasn't the end of it. She then had to feed Truffle biscuit by hand. Truffle was a demanding cat. And again, when Truffle had to leave the house, Mum would get up, open the doors, out would go Truffle. The walls were covered by paintings by New Zealand artists. Mum was an artist herself, but she always preferred New Zealand artist paintings on the walls. The walls were also covered in books and artefacts she'd collected around the world. It was a wonderful, homely place. She loved it very, very much. My mother chose to die at home. The family respected that, and we respect anyone who chooses to die at home. Surrounded by the people you love, the things you love, the cat you love. An individual's choice that shouldn't be questioned. My mother was a GP, a medical doctor. She had terminal cancer, and she knew better than most people what was awaiting her, the ghastly, terrible death from cancer. So she made the courageous decision to take control of her death by stopping eating. Only one thing can happen if you stop eating. You die. It seemed a very clear, rational decision, and we, her children, did not question it. For two reasons. One, she was our mother, and you don't question your mother. Sometimes. But secondly, she was a medical doctor, and we assumed she'd made a wise decision. At that time, I was her primary caregiver. And together with Mum, we assumed she would die tomorrow. She was very ill, she was elderly, and she wasn't eating. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. It never came. 5 weeks later, she was still in her bed, unable to move her limbs, unable to move her arms. Her flesh was decomposing to feed her vital organs. Her brain was functioning quite normally. She was in a dreadful, dreadful situation. I'll speak about it. My mother then made a second courageous decision. She asked for help to die. She realised she was not going to die quickly after 5 weeks. It could go on for another days or weeks. So she asked for help to die because she got to the point where she could not help herself. And she made a very difficult decision of asking the person nearest and dearest to her to help her to die. And I was faced with a terrible dilemma of being asked by my mother to help her to die, when I'd been totally focused on keeping her alive. After much agonising, I realised I didn't have a decision at all, because it was what my mother wanted. There was nothing to think about. And if I'd let her carry on dying the way she was, that would have been totally inhumane, and it would have been a ghastly death. Listening to my account, listening to my account is the front.
Not my fault, Thomas. Sorry, guys.
Now that's the kind of thing you expect to happen in Africa quite often. We're off in the dark. Listening to my account now, you're probably full of many questions. Why did my mother go on a hunger strike? Why, when the hunger strike was going so very badly, did I not take it to a hospital or a hospice? Why did she not end her own life when she had the ability to do it by other means? You've got many very good questions. But every question you have, we had a very good answer at that time. At that time means those particular circumstances that we were in. We had a very good answer. So before you, or maybe not you, before people judge me, I would like them to put themselves in exactly that same situation and ask themselves what they would have done. I believe any humane person would have done exactly the same thing. So I've done my sentence, but I did not commit a crime. And I've stood my ground, and I've made the point that it is not a crime to help someone to die when they have made the decision for themselves. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, this is no longer about me. Sure, I've received some public attention here and in South Africa. It's now about the fact that many people will find themselves in the same situation that I was in. It's about the fact that many people will find themselves in the same situation that my mother was in. And surely, in a civilized society, a person who is terminally ill has a right to say, no thank you, I've had enough. I want to die with dignity, and society should respect that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Davison, and sincere apologies for the technical difficulties. Professor Gillett is a man of many parts, one of New Zealand's leading neurosurgeons, a psychologist, a philosopher, a soon-to-be-performed playwright, but also a medical ethicist with particular expertise in end-of-life issues. Based in the Bioethics Centre here at the University of Otago, where he has been Professor of Medical Ethics since 1995, Grant has authored a number of books, including Bioethics in the Clinic, Hippocratic Reflections, published in 2004, and more recently, Subjectivity and Being Somebody, Human Identity and Neuroethics. Grant has written numerous scholarly articles on euthanasia and end-of-life issues, and has been an influential figure in this field for many years, indeed more than 20. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grant Gillett.
Well, as a bioethicist, one is a kind of amateur philosopher, and so approaches the thing in a kind of flat-footed and simple-minded way that philosophers do. The argument regarding euthanasia, it seems, is quite persuasive. Patients should be enabled to make important decisions about their own lives and medical treatment, and doctors should help them. A decision to hasten your own death is a decision about your life and your medical treatment. Therefore, patients who make decisions to hasten their own death should be able to make those decisions, and their doctors should help them. However, doctors have a hang-up in this area, one that they actually share with theologians, and not just Christian theologians, in fact, theologians of every faith, wherever in the world. That is that a human life has a value, even when the person living that life cannot appreciate that value. They also share with religious thinkers the view that people may often make mistakes about what lies ahead of them and what they ought to do about it. Given those two values, they then turn to some research. And in fact, there is a lot of research about people who make decisions to hasten their own death. There are a number of features which are evident in that group of people. Many of them are depressed, appropriately, because a significant subgroup have terminal illnesses, and if you're not depressed by a terminal illness, well, you're missing something. Many of them are anxious about the mode of their death and how they are going to cope with it. And again, one would say that's completely reasonable. If you were not anxious, if in the small hours of the morning that kind of thing didn't stop you from sleeping, then of course you're also missing something. Many of them are worried that the suffering is going to mean that they lose control of themselves, and that when they lose control they're going to find themselves in an unfamiliar setting among unfamiliar people who do not understand them and their values, and who do not share with them a sense of what is worthwhile for them in their lives. And the question is whether, given that that is the reality, what our response should be to the decisions such people make. Doctors also have one other significant attitude, and that is that in decisions in which they feel emotionally compelled by the appeal that the patient is making to them, they should never be isolated in their decision making. Almost all examples of doctors who make bad decisions and who get into situations which, in retrospect, they would never want to get themselves into, find that at the time, for one reason or another, their own life problems, the need for the patient to look to them for certain things that the patient may not be finding elsewhere, and so on, they have become isolated. They and the patient have formed a dyad in which a reflective attitude towards the events that are unfolding in a tragic way is impossible for them. In New Zealand, we know, as Sean's mother would have known, that decisions to limit your own treatment are yours to make. Doctors cannot inflict upon you treatment that with a sound mind you say you no longer want. We know that you can have access to palliative care, that can mean that a situation that you yourself cannot imagine could unfold any more than in a certain kind of a way can be looked at by somebody else who may see it different, who may be able to imagine other possibilities, who doesn't need to take you off to an unfamiliar place to try and work those out with you in a way that's acceptable to you and to them in the light of their duty of care. We know that if all else fails, the doctor is entitled to give you whatever drugs you need to be comfortable as you approach your death, even if the doctor has reason to believe, rightly or wrongly, that those drugs may hasten your death. We know all that. These things, however, are hard to keep clearly in view when you're in the midst of a situation. You don't get to stand back from your own death and the tragedy that's unfolding with you in the middle of it, because you are in the middle, and it's hard to make the decisions. And anybody who's right in the middle of it with you, because they kind of belong to you, they're part of it, which a doctor is not supposed to become, is also going to find it very hard to stand back and look at those realities and imagine beyond the apparent limits of the situation in which you find yourself. For those reasons, the medical profession in New Zealand shares with the faith traditions the conviction that we should not aid patients when they make decisions to hasten their own deaths, and that we do not need a change of law in this country to allow that to happen. We do believe that where we are involved, where we are able to bring our skills to bear, where we are able to care in a way that centres on the needs of the patient rather than on the needs of the system, we can make sure that death does not happen in a way that a person would hate it to. And if that is something that we can feel fairly confident about, then we must ask, why is it that tragedies happen where that isn't the way things unfold? And very often, I think we can find reasons. Very often there are misconceptions. Very often the person has despaired. Very often the people that are so involved with that person have been drawn into the circle of despair and feel that it would be unfair to not be sympathetic and feel along with that person into the crisis that they're all experiencing. But that's exactly the situation where somebody who's paid to care, whose profession is caring, whose skills are bringing about a harmonious death without bringing it to an untimely end. That's exactly the situation where such a person ought to be involved. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Marion Street, was born and raised in Plymouth and has been a Labour List MP since 2005. She is currently her party's spokesperson for health and for disarmament and arms control, but it is in her capacity as proposer of a private members' bill to legalise certain end-of-life options that she's been invited to participate in the forum this evening. Marion's proposed bill has not yet reached the stage of being entered in the ballot box, but her hope is that it will provide Parliament with its third opportunity to review the law with respect to issues around assisted suicide and euthanasia. Marion is based in Nelson and before entering Parliament worked as a secondary school teacher, a trades unionist and a founding director of the Centre for Labour Studies at the University of Auckland. Please join me in welcoming Marion.
Kia ora koutou katoa. E ngā kai whakahaere tēnei hui tēnā koutou, e ngā iwi katoa. Tēnei te mihi nui kia koutou, tēnā koutou kia ora koutou katoa. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Andrew, and others who have organised this debate. It's been my great privilege and pleasure just today to meet Sean Davison. And I am a richer person for having met him. My bill and my impetus for promoting a members' bill of this nature comes from a group of people whom I met in Nelson towards the end of last year. They invited me and other politicians to a meeting. It was a voluntary euthanasia society meeting in Nelson. And I was very pleased to attend. And they were looking for somebody who would promote a piece of legislation, as Paul said, to have a third go in Parliament at passing legislation to allow end-of-life choices. And I said yes, I would be prepared to do that. I was not prepared to do it in the white heat of a general election campaign, because that is not often the locus of sensible debate in my experience. So I waited until after the election and decided that I would proceed with this. And just as a matter of interest, before the end of last year and before I'd started putting words down on the page, I consulted with two leaders of faith in the Nelson community, one Pākehā, one Māori. First of all, because I work closely with them on a day-to-day basis anyway as they minister to the communities in Nelson, and I didn't want to take them by surprise. And secondly, because I was interested to know what their views were. And, quelle surprise, their views were quite different. The dominant religious tradition in this country of Christianity, in all its denominational guises, does not have a monolithic view on this issue. But we cannot have a debate in New Zealand about end-of-life choices without having contributions from faith communities. Faith communities of all kinds. I would not wish us to have a completely secular debate about this issue, because life isn't just secular, and however much we might want politics and law to be governed by and the product of the best accumulation of rationality, it's not always like that. And life is not always like that. And you get a House of Representatives. So, for me, this bill is about those things that Tom spoke of before. And I read the synopsis of his paper, or the short version that he's just delivered tonight. I read that before I came here. And I thought, yes, he's hit on the words that I use exactly. Compassion, autonomy, dignity, self-determination. And for me, this bill is about those things. It is above all else about compassion. But it is about dignity. Dignity in dying and the choice. So, autonomy about the end-of-life choice. In brief, I intend my bill to cover those with terminal illnesses and those with irrecoverable conditions, which are not necessarily in themselves terminal, but irrecoverable conditions which make life unbearable. There are 3 levels of protection that I want to ensure emerge in the words on the page in the bill. The first level of protection must be for the person themselves. The wishes of a person to die must be made by a person of sound mind. They must be mentally competent and attested by 2 physicians to be competent to make such a decision and to understand what it means. But similarly, they must be protected from coercion. So arguments about being a burden must be resisted at every turn in this legislation. There must be no coercion, whether from unsympathetic family members, unscrupulous insurance companies, or anybody else who might have an interest in the demise of a person without their being in control of that decision. But the other protection that must exist for people who wish to exercise a choice over how they end their lives must be that their wishes must be observed. That their wishes, once they have completed all the requirements, not be able to be overturned when they have lapsed into a situation, a condition where they are no longer able to argue for themselves. And therefore I want my bill to include advance directives so that people may say that in the event of certain situations developing or my becoming incapable of expressing my view that this is what I wish, when I was in sound mind and full competence, to have happen. The second level of protection has to be for physicians. Again, protection against coercion. And it may be that specialists are involved, but it may be that your family doctor is involved. And over years and decades of relationships with a family GP, there must not be any coercion for a physician to do something which is against their worldview, religious tradition, ethical imperatives, moral conceptions. But similarly, there must be protection against criminal liability. And thirdly, the third level of protection that I want to introduce, which is different from some other jurisdictions around the world which do allow assisted dying, and that is protection for family members who are asked, like Sean, to do the unthinkable. Protection from criminal liability. So that the situation that Sean found himself in cannot be repeated. In the context of all of this, there are lots of other considerations. The one is about palliative care, and I have the greatest of respect for those who work in palliative care. We have very good quality palliative care, but that does not provide the protections or the opportunities for end-of-life choices. One of the things that impressed me about the group that met in Nelson first and have subsequently been represented also in other groups I've met with is that there's been a combination of people of faith and people of no faith. And so this is an issue that straddles a wide range of perspectives and convictions in our country. In the end, I think the fact that people whom we know and love, who have lived vibrant, autonomous, self-determining lives, should be allowed at their end stages to be at least as autonomous and self-determining. This then becomes a matter of human rights. The right to choose to lead this life with dignity, exercising all the self-determination that you exercised during your life, seems to me to be something of huge importance. In 1995, the first vote on this issue was lost by 61 to 29, 2 to 1 against in Parliament. 8 years later, in 2003, the vote was lost again by 60 to 57. And those three missing votes, those three different votes, one was an abstention by Dale Jones of the New Zealand First Party. And the other two were people who were not there and chose not, or perhaps didn't, I don't know, but did not exercise a proxy vote. One was John Tanaheri from the Labour Party, and one was Heather Roy from the ACT Party. None of those three people is in Parliament now. I can't tell you which way my colleagues in Parliament will go on this issue. It will, without a doubt, be a conscience vote. And I can't tell you where the balance lies. What I do know is that 20 of those who voted against it last time are still or are back in Parliament. 12 of those who voted in favour of it last time are still or back in Parliament. And so we have to revisit the arguments again. But one thing I'm certain of is that an event like this tonight And the meaningless prosecution of somebody like Sean shows that there is an interest and a social debate and a social conversation which needs to be had. And I would urge all of you, at the point in which my bill comes before Parliament, to lobby every member of Parliament you can lay your hands on and tell them what you think. Tell them what you think. Because in the end, this will be a conscience vote, and it's one of those moments when a House of Representatives gets a chance to be a House of Representatives. Thank you very much.
Our fourth speaker, John Kleinsman, has worked at the Nathaniel Centre since 2002 and has been its director since May 2010. The Nathaniel Centre was named in honour of a child who was diagnosed at birth with incurable health problems and who lived for less than 2 months. The Centre is an agency of the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference with a remit to undertake research into bioethical issues, promote educational opportunities in bioethics, and be an advisory and resource centre for individuals and educational and community groups. Prior to joining the Nathaniel Centre, John worked in the disability support and drug and alcohol rehabilitation sectors. He holds a master's degree in moral theology from this university and is currently completing his doctoral studies through the Sydney College of Divinity. Like Marianne, John has come down from Wellington, especially to join us this evening. Please join me in welcoming John Kleinsman.
Thank you, Paul, Andrew, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It will be no surprise to you that I'm implacably opposed to euthanasia. It's my strongly held personal view. It also happens that I'm implacably opposed to the legalisation of euthanasia. Now, you might think that those two views go together, those two statements go together. But they need not go together. Because I'm opposed to a number of things that are legal in New Zealand. And I recognise that other people disagree. And I don't want to take that choice away from them. It's part of democracy, it's part of living in a democratic and free society. However, democracy, founded as it is on choice and individual empowerment, I think flirts with its own demise to the extent that it tries to offer its citizens unlimited, unfettered freedom or choice. Democratic freedom is, I think, necessarily constrained by a consideration for what I would call the common good. And this remains a critical test for any proposed law change. I think that's what's at stake here.
Oh yes, it does.
Sincere apologies, it sounds like a fault went out this morning that hasn't been able to be fixed yet. But bear with us and we hope that might fix later. Keep going.
Maybe it's divine intervention. I want to say that from a moral perspective, I think one's personal or ideological perspective on this issue, mine included, is actually irrelevant. It's a complex issue with societal consequences. Now, I think there's too much at stake to leave this question simply to individual choice. We're making laws, or we're considering the changing of laws. I think priority must be to ensure that the interests of the majority are not prejudiced by giving choices to a minority. And if someone can convince me that giving people the choice to to be euthanized would not have a negative impact on the choices and well-being of others, I could live, albeit reluctantly, with the legalisation of euthanasia in our society. I have no desire to force my morality or my faith or my choices onto others. In the same way, though, just as it's possible to be ideologically opposed to euthanasia and accept its legalisation in a safe environment, so too I think it's possible to be personally in favour of euthanasia and not necessarily favour its legalisation. And I think that is why in the last 2 years, 9 different jurisdictions around the world have looked at and voted down euthanasia legislation. The real question, I think, is whether it can be safely implemented. And I have yet to be convinced of that. And the more I listen and read, the less convinced I am of that. Before I continue, I want to say that I am also dissatisfied with the status quo in New Zealand. I don't think the current situation is good enough. There are amazing examples of health professionals and carers providing outstanding service to the dying and their families every day, in hospices and in the community. And I've witnessed that firsthand with the death of my own mother. But there is not currently equitable access to palliative care in New Zealand, and the level and quality of care does vary. And it is, to my mind, totally unacceptable that palliative care is not properly funded by the government as other health needs are. This needs to be urgently addressed at a political level. And I think the rest home industry also needs to lift its game. So we do need to work for something better, but to head down the road of legalising euthanasia, I think, is not the solution. In fact, I think it would only compound things further, including the development and funding of better palliative care, as overseas experience has shown. The current lack of equitable access to palliative care, I think, presents a strong reason why it's actually premature to debate a change to the law in New Zealand around euthanasia. Until every New Zealander has equitable access and full access to high-quality palliative care, I actually think it's unethical to consider changing the law. In these circumstances, it would be an illusion to offer euthanasia as a choice, because in the absence of real choice, death by assisted suicide could become an act of desperation rather than an act of autonomy. Choosing to die can never be truly voluntary in a society that fails to provide the full range of palliative care options and also quality residential care. In this situation, unwittingly or otherwise, legalising euthanasia would actually be ultimately empowering the healthcare system to steer patients to suicide at the expense of patient empowerment. When palliative care is properly funded, then I think we can have this debate. I also want to make the point that we don't make decisions in isolation. It's a point that came out in Tom's paper. We always make them as part of a bigger context. The seemingly personal and private decisions we make both reflect the society we live in and also shape that society. And it's important to consider the current context that we live in. And in my mind, it's perhaps one of the most dangerous times in recent history to try and legalise euthanasia. Why do I say that? It's a fact, I think, that we're looking at the increasing isolation of the elderly, and one of the biggest problems in the Western world, and New Zealand included, is growing elder abuse. There are the changing demographics and increasing numbers of elderly people as the baby boomers come to retirement age. There are increasingly rising costs of medical and residential care, and we're looking at a shrinking tax base. We live in a society that has a deficit understanding of sickness and disability. It's a society that I think is defined largely by ableism. We're looking at a society in which families are increasingly fragmented, often because of geographical separation, children and parents living large distances apart. And there is, like it or not, a rising sense, partly related to these things, of people feeling that they are a burden as they grow older and or are ill. So relaxing the law on euthanasia in this context is fraught with possibilities for abuse. I believe it will lead to new pathways for elder abuse. Family relationships are complicated by long distances as well as financial considerations, and these pressures, I think, are such that what I call base motives will in many cases inevitably find their way into life-ending decision-making. In the current environment in which euthanasia is illegal, people have to think long and hard about their motives. And I genuinely believe that this is the case with Sean and with his mother. However, if the law is changed, there will no longer be the need for that same degree of soul-searching. It will actually be much easier for people to disguise or even deny their more base motives, if I can use that word, if we change the law. It's part of human nature. I've also heard the concern in Marion's address about protecting people from such pressures and motives. And firstly, I think this shows how real these fears are, how real the fear of abuse actually is. But I don't think there is any law that can adequately protect against these risks. In addition, the very act of making euthanasia legal will remove the most effective barrier that we currently have against such abuses. Abuses will occur, as we've seen overseas. Just as importantly, if euthanasia is legalised in a society such as ours, the nexus of the factors I've described will contribute to a growing sense of the elderly and sick people feeling that they are a burden to others. And there's no law that can actually legislate against this. From a moral perspective, the burden of proof will, in these circumstances, shift onto the elderly person or the disabled person to justify their continued existence. As Tom mentioned, the right to die could become very quickly a duty to die, and this is not free choice. It becomes an ongoing choice for those people, something that they will need to continually have to resist. And assisted suicide law says, in effect, if you are terminally ill, a more lenient view will be taken of someone helping you to commit suicide than if you are healthy. In other words, if you're ill or disabled, the message, even if it's unintentional, and it's no less powerful for that fact, the message is that your life is somehow less worthy of respect because you can be treated differently. And we will come, I think, to see such people differently, to look at the elderly and the disabled differently. It's what one commentator calls the distant and offhanded dismissal of the quality of life of certain people. Subtle, but very powerful. Granted, such pressures might not matter for a handful of strong-minded people who are firmly resolved on wanting to end their lives. And they tend to be the people whose stories make the media. But most people at the end of life aren't like that. Large numbers of people, I fear, will find themselves on a course about which they were less than wholehearted, but one to which they could see no other alternative. It's still a choice, but it's a very distorted and a very impossible choice. If I can make a further point. Euthanasia or assisted suicide, if legalised, cannot be limited to a small and targeted group. Once the Pandora's box is open, the experience overseas shows that there is a predictable progression from voluntary to non-voluntary euthanasia. If we think about it, no medical treatment is accessed or denied on the basis of an inability to give consent. So if we admit that individual choice is sufficient as a basis for euthanasia, then we have to come to that next step, because there's no logical basis for restricting the choice only to certain groups, for example those who are terminally ill, or ultimately denying it to those who are incapable for some reason of giving consent. Why should they be discriminated against? Why should their suffering be discriminated against? So on what grounds will we deny it to the young who are severely depressed and who want suicide, or those who are overcome, whether temporarily or more long-term, by various forms of mental suffering? Professor Sheena McLean, who had tenure here at the university for a while, was part of a panel that completed a report. And they state in that report that there is no principled basis for excluding people suffering greatly and permanently, but not imminently dying. And this, I think, calls for a degree of honesty if we are to have the debate in New Zealand. And it's a level of honesty that I actually have yet to find in this debate. Because if we're going to debate the merits of legalising voluntary euthanasia, then politicians and New Zealanders should actually realise that there will be that logical progression from voluntary to non-voluntary euthanasia. So we either have to accept non-voluntary euthanasia together with the voluntary, while knowing that abuses will continue to occur and even increase in occurrence, or if we are uncomfortable with the idea of non-voluntary and involuntary euthanasia for those with dementia and mental illnesses, those who are young and old, then we actually have to reject both. For me, it's literally an all or nothing. It's a farce to talk about debating voluntary euthanasia. I might conclude. For me, it ultimately comes down to one question. Will it be more harmful to deny the ultimately small number of patients that want euthanasia? And statistics show that the number of people who in the public are generally in favour of euthanasia, according to polls, which can vary anywhere between 70 and 85%, actually in practice translate to an extremely small minority of people with terminal illness. So is it more harmful to deny the small group than it is to expose much larger numbers of vulnerable patients to the risks and abuses of coercion, given that there are no adequate legal safeguards that are able to be put in place that have real teeth? Despite supposed safeguards, euthanasia, if legalised, will be practiced through the prism of social inequality and prejudice that characterises the delivery of services in all segments of our society, including health and disability care. Those most vulnerable to abuse, error or indifference are the poor, the minorities, those who are least educated, least empowered, those who are least able to access the sort of medical care that could perhaps give them the extension of life that they want. Any change in the law, therefore, I conclude, will only contribute to increasing pressure within our secular and economically constrained society to ease out the frail, the disabled and the elderly. It will ultimately empower not individuals, but the state and health professionals. So I say, let's not go there because it's more trouble than it's worth. Thank you.
Colin Gavaghan is the New Zealand Law Foundation Director in Emerging Technologies and an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law here at the University of Otago. In 2010, Colin joined Otago from the University of Glasgow, where he had been a lecturer in medical ethics and law. Colin has published extensively on a range of subjects, including legal and ethical questions raised by reproductive and genetic technologies, end-of-life issues, and general medico-legal matters. He's widely regarded as a leading international scholar in medical law and ethics. He will give a brief outline of the current legal situation on our topic. Please join me in welcoming Colin.
Thank you very much. I'd asked Andrew to read that last line. It's a bit cringe-inducing, but there you go. My remit is to cover what I used to spend an entire semester teaching in 5 minutes. Luckily, I come from Glasgow, so the ability to speak ridiculously quickly is kind of innate. But what I try to do is just to maybe express a few of the basics about the law in this area, and maybe in the process dispel a couple of misunderstandings. The first thing I'm going to say is that there is no such, many of you may know this already, there is no such crime as euthanasia in New Zealand. We're talking about activity that is firmly within the realm of the law of homicide, the general law of homicide. The second thing that people may or may not know is that an act can be homicide regardless of the extent to which it shortens someone's life. Your action can shorten someone's life by 5 minutes or by 50 years. It's still technically, it can be homicide. Now, having said that, when you're dealing with someone who is very close to the end of life, who is very sick, the law can face, or the prosecution can face, a particular difficulty. And that difficulty relates to establishing that the action in question actually had an effect on shortening someone's life. And this is why Sean, when he was originally charged, was charged with attempted murder. Why other people who've been charged and convicted in this area have been charged with attempted murder. Because it's a difficult thing to prove when you're dealing with someone in the very final stages of life that the intervention actually made any difference at all. You can prove that it was an attempt to do so. It is established that if an action did shorten someone's life, then it will also be required for the prosecution to show, typically, that it was done intentionally. And this brings us to an area that Grant talked about, which is the so-called doctrine of double effect. The rule that says if a doctor provides such quantities of analgesia that the patient's life is shortened in the process of alleviating their pain, then a defence can be available. That can be permissible conduct. Now, it's a tricky and contested business. Not everyone thinks that's it's a particularly honest position or a consistent position for the law to take. However, it possibly does result in more humane treatment. I leave that for you to decide. Assisted suicide, which is ultimately the offence with which Sean was convicted, is dealt with separately in the law of New Zealand. And the difference essentially relates to who takes the final step. Assisted suicide applies to the situation where the deceased themselves took the final step at the end of their life. They swallowed the medication, or they took whatever step was required. The offence lies in assisting, as the name suggests, assisting them in doing so. And there are two ways in which the law recognises that offence. The first version relates to inciting, counselling, or procuring a suicide or attempted suicide. And that imagines the kind of situation where the defendant played a kind of initiating role, where he encouraged the individual or suggested it in the first place, I suppose. And the second and wider category is the aiding and abetting. Now, precisely what conduct would constitute aiding and abetting suicide is hard to say for sure. There hasn't been much in the way of case law in New Zealand. There's been a little bit more, but not a great deal in the United Kingdom. But I think it's safe to say that a degree of uncertainty surrounds quite how far one could go before one risks incurring the wrath of the criminal law in this regard. It certainly seems, if anyone saw the case reported in the paper a couple of weeks ago of Evans Mott, who appears to have assisted his wife to take her life by gathering information for her, didn't take any more active step than that, that could, in theory, it would appear to constitute the offence of assisting suicide. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, we had a case where the individual wanted to assist his wife to travel to a jurisdiction where euthanasia was legal. In this case, it was to Switzerland. And he wanted to know, having done this, having helped her book her flights and get on the plane, would he be likely to face charges on his return to the UK? And these areas are still somewhat uncertain, still to be determined by law. But finally, it's worth remembering, and again, one or two of the preceding speakers have alluded to this, that doctors can sometimes knowingly shorten life by, they can do it, as we've seen, by administering high doses of analgesia, but they can also do it by withdrawing or withholding life-prolonging treatment. And they can do this where a competent patient has requested it or declined the treatment, or they can do this where the treatment is felt to be having no beneficial effect on the patient. And this is permitted, as Grant already suggested. We have a right to decline treatment, and that right, if we are competent, has to be respected. This arises because the law draws a pretty fundamental distinction between acts and omissions. Now, this is an area of law in which the kind of concerns John identified are already present and already dealt with by the law. Whether you think they're dealt with adequately, of course, is a different question. But the issue of coercion, the issue of competence, the possibility that someone may be being pushed in a particular direction or choosing out of depression rather than authentic choice, those concerns are already with us. And any approach, I think, to the questions John's answering are relevant to the status quo as well. There's also a doubt, I think, about where the line's being drawn in this regard. Not everyone's quite happy that some of the things characterised as omissions rather than acts are properly so regarded. Particularly, I think that's true when we enter the domain of a kind of so-called active omission, where a ventilator has to be switched off or a feeding tube has to be withdrawn. To some people, this looks more like an act than an omission. And certainly, if I were to sneak into ICU and start switching off ventilators, I think that's the view the law would probably take. So, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that the current legal situation isn't maybe as black and white as is sometimes made out. There's still doubts as to what precisely would constitute the offence of assisted suicide here and in other jurisdictions. And it's the case that the law sometimes does allow doctors to do things that might look to a lay person quite a lot like killing. Thank you very much.
Now, the advertised conclusion to tonight's event is at 7:30, so we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. Just some ground rules. Tonight's event is being filmed, and because we're in a large lecture theatre, we'd ask you to come to either of the two mics. So a mic here and a mic here. So if you have a question, please come down, and obviously it'd be good if there was a line of people coming so we could be quite clear who was asking the next question. We are particularly anxious for you to ask questions and not to make statements. I'm sure you understand the necessity for that. You may ask a question of a particular panel member, or you might like to ask a question to the panel in general, and the panel can decide amongst themselves who in particular will answer the question. The panel have microphones, and so are able to stay with that. So the time is now ours for discussion and questions. Who would like to begin? Yes, please come to this one. Just come down. That's it.
This is more or less a statement. The word euthanasia is Greek for good death, and I don't like the way the word is used because a good death is a good death. And you're assisting suicide, death, okay, but you're not assisting euthanasia because it itself is a good death. And I find that very irritating.
Would you like to come out to the microphone here? And feel free to come down, somebody who would like to ask the next question here, and just wait and we'll... Yeah, John.
Just a general response to that statement rather than question. I think the question of language is in fact vitally important, and I think there are increasing problems with certain words. I think there's a problem with the use of the word dignity and death or dignity and dying. I think this is becoming a problem with the word compassion, euthanasia. I think we actually need to define what we mean by these. I don't think, as panelists, none of us are looking for an undignified death. I'm certainly not arguing that people should die an undignified death. I think what's at stake is actually the meaning behind these words, and I think too often we jump to use these words without stopping to think, in fact, what they mean. And I think if we're going to have this discussion or conversation, we'll start with that we need to start to think more precisely and be more careful about the language we use and the assumptions that actually underlie the words that we choose to use. And particularly, I think, avoid the use of euphemisms.
I admit I'm mostly involved with this because my sister hung herself when she wanted to die, sadly enough, which was not a pleasant death. I asked this question many years ago because I remember you granted when it being quite a young man.
You're better than I.
I did not get an answer then. When I was young, there was a war lived in England. Young men were called up, killed or be killed. There was no choice. They were called up, they had to do it. They didn't want to die. Some of my friends and some of my relatives were killed. And they really did not want to die. But it was accepted as right and proper that this should happen. And if there was another war, the same thing could happen, and probably would. Now we're old, we're told we must stay alive, irrespective of how much we want to die. It makes no sense to me. So can you please make some sense of it?
I think if you want to value the life of every human being, you find yourself in principle opposed to many of the reasons people have found in the past, and a great proportion of those we're finding in the present, to send young men to war. I think you also find yourself opposed to moves in society that lead you towards not seeing the value of a life when that value is effaced by terminal illness, made difficult to recognise by what we call a disability, or in some other way eludes us and may elude the person whose life it is. I think in those circumstances, doctors often find themselves wanting to do something to allow the person concerned to recover the value that they need to recover in order to live their life for as long as they should, and not to be forced to live it longer than they should, or have it cut off earlier than it should be.
I think a response that I would want to make is perhaps encapsulated in the fact that while I'm the promoter of this bill, I also hold the shadow disarmament and arms control portfolio. I value life. Life has intrinsic value. Quality of life is also important.
I could add to that too. In South Africa, I founded an organisation called Dignity South Africa. We want to change the law in that country too. But it's very, very clear to define where we draw the line as to who can accept assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia. So we draw the line at terminally ill people. You've got to draw a line. It's crucial to define the law. But in my capacity as leader of this organisation, I meet so many people, or people who know people, who have a dreadful life where they're not really living, almost not living, but they're not terminally ill. So my organisation, and maybe Mary and Street has the same problem, we wouldn't allow people to take that option based on the law. And I'd never be allowed to say publicly that I agree that that person should be allowed to, but you know what I mean.
Perhaps three very quick questions. One, can we start using the terminology around the subject and say, rather than euthanasia, say assistance in dying? So that's one thing to use. Secondly, if we didn't give assistance in birthing, we would look pretty barbaric. Can we put that alongside of assistance in dying? And thirdly, what can we do to help encourage MPs to have the courage to look at this issue, perhaps even with the suggestion that they may get more votes instead of fewer.
Well, I'd like to take up the issue of terminology, and it was one that was raised earlier as well. There is one thing about the terms that we all use in conversation about this issue, and there is another in the words, I've used the phrase before, the words on the page in a bill. In my bill you will not see the word compassion or dignity, but that is the bill's intention. Nobody has a monopoly on the definition of dignity or compassion, but there's a pretty universal understanding, whether it's Chris Marshall's definition or somebody else's, of what we mean. And perhaps we can usefully talk about these things, but you know, they used to usefully talk about the number of angels that could fit on the tin head as well. So it seems to me to get on with it is important. So I, in consultation with people who have been looking at drafting legislation like this for some time, I've gone backwards and forwards on the name of it. And I've resolved to call it End-of-Life Choice Bill. End-of-Life choice. It encapsulates some of the things that I wish most to convey. Choices at the end of our lives. When the end of our life occurs is different in different circumstances. But having a choice about the end of your life seems to me to be the critical component.
Angels on the legal pattern are probably no more useful to debate than whether God can ride a bicycle. but I do think terminology is important. I try to use the words decisions to hasten death because that really includes both physician-assisted suicide and active voluntary euthanasia, the giving of a patient a drug at their own request that will shorten their life. It also includes decisions where an active life-sustaining measure, such as a ventilator, is terminated at a patient's request. And I noted that where there is a treatment that we are giving persons that they no longer regard as being anything other than a burden to them, as a profession we're required to listen to what they're saying and withdraw the treatment.
Yes.
This is not meant to be a trivial question, but it sounds picked up. Is it where we are?
2 seconds and we'll just reset the light.
Look, better in the dark. This question occurred to me on the bus.
Let's try. Just wait for it. I'll wait for it. Wait for it.
Right.
Hey, I hope I've forgotten the question.
ahead, nobody will be doing this because we'll have already dealt with it. Like in the Egyptian pharaohs, you died in somebody's tomb. And we're just at an unfortunate patch in history, are we? Where we've got to debate it.
I agree at the time in history right now. If you go back 20 years, sorry, I've gone back to that.
I don't want to fall down as well.
20 years ago we didn't talk about HIV, AIDS, homosexuality. 30 years ago we didn't talk about abortion. Now we all talk about it freely at the dinner table. And the one thing we don't talk about now is death and dying. And I feel it's because of the stage we're at. And soon we will talk about it. There'll be dinner table discussion. And it won't be a taboo subject to scared of. And I think in 5, 10 years' time we'll be laughing at my face and saying, how did that possibly happen?
It strikes me that in some ways we're jumping the gun, that we need to have a fuller discussion, I think, about what is a good death. And I think until we've had that discussion, it seems to me that the debate about euthanasia has arisen in certain societies only, and that it's a symptom of something much deeper that is going on within our society. And I think until we have that broader discussion, it's a little bit like doing a thesis. I think you start with your terminology and defining your question and getting your question right. I'm not sure that we're answering the right question yet. I think we need to have that fuller debate in society about what it means to live well and to die well. And then I think we may be in a position to decide whether hastening death in certain circumstances or all circumstances is in fact synonymous with or fits with what we think good living and good dying is. I think this is a premature debate.
Sean said that he wouldn't dare make a certain statement. What's happened to free speech? Could we have a legal statement about that, please? Well, why are some things not able to be said?
Well, the difficulty is it's a very sensitive issue, and we want the law to be changed. If you don't have very clearly defined law and points around it, it'll never ever get passed. To get it passed, we make it very, very clear that only a person who is terminally ill. But I said I wouldn't talk about other issues because I'm running an organisation seeking the law change. In my personal capacity, I have other viewpoints which I'm not going to express because I'm sticking to what our organisation is standing for. Somebody who is terminally ill having the right to choose a time of death.
My question is directed at Marianne. Just with your bell, you mentioned that a requirement for the law to apply is the person has to be of sound mind. So how have you taken into account the situation that Professor Gillett referred to, that a lot of people approaching death or who have terminal illness have got depression? So would they be considered of sound mind? And if they're not, then would that really reduce the application of that law?
That's a really good question, and certainly there are some jurisdictions that quite explicitly prohibit people who are clinically depressed and have a diagnosis of depression from making such decisions. And I think, as we heard, it's pretty unusual not to be depressed if you're in some of these circumstances. But to have clinical depression alone as the cause would not be permissible in my law. But to have a couple of physicians attest that the person is of sound mind and understanding fully the consequences of their decision taking into account whether or not they are upset or depressed because they are facing imminent decline is a decision, I think, that can be made by physicians, but certainly simply a diagnosis of clinical depression alone would not pass the threshold in my bill. It does become a matter of judgment, and that's the point. It is always a matter of judgment, whether it's a medical professional or whether in the end it's a judge. A clinical judgment, absolutely, by two separate clinicians that would have to be made to recognise that this person is of sound mind and capable of fully understanding what it is they're deciding.
There are a couple of issues concerning depression. One is whether it would provide a basis on what it be provided. And I've heard Marianne say that at least under her model it wouldn't be. Other countries have taken other views on that. The second question is whether the presence of depression would be enough to allow us to say this individual is not of sound mind, this individual is not competent. I think we have to be careful there that the diagnostic criteria for findings of depression have grown quite considerably, and the draft version of the new DSM-5 looks set to widen them even further. There may be good reasons for doing that, particularly in the USA with the provision of healthcare, the HMOs are set up, that a diagnosis is actually necessary. It doesn't necessarily fall under this or any other legal system that depression is incompatible with competence to make a decision. Particularly, there's a slight danger, I think, of definitional circularity here, because if you look at some of the criteria for a finding of clinical depression, they include things like suicidal ideation. They include things like pessimistic feelings about the future. Now, obviously, you can see the potential problem. If someone has been told they have motor neuron disease and in the final stages, being pessimistic about the future doesn't seem to me to be incompatible with being a sound mind. And of course, if you're going to say that anyone who wishes to commit suicide is incompetent to choose assisted suicide, then we've got ourselves into a kind of loop that we may not want. So it's a slightly tricky issue, and a clinical finding of depression may or may not, it seems to be compatible with the legal finding of competence.
Sean, this is to you just personally before I ask my question. I want to say to you how happy I am that you honoured your mother with obedience and love. I find that compassion outstanding. Marion, this is my question to you. The minority, as we're talking about terminally ill, I am, are covered in the end of life choices. But what about the vulnerable, the phantom patient? No one knows and no one visits, and they are cared for by nurses and doctors, but no one comes. And the poor, the very poor, who will be the voice for these precious people? Will that area be covered in your bill?
I think, thank you for the question. I think the short answer is that not everything will be covered in my bill, and it will not seek to answer all the questions that are raised by others. It will seek to deal with a particular situation or set of circumstances, and will have requirements that need to be met before those circumstances can be addressed. For the poor, for those who are genuinely alone, I think they are no less competent to decide. It's whether or not they have access to a physician who will assist them to carry out their wishes that is perhaps the issue there.
They are the majority of our elderly, I'm talking about, in our care in New Zealand. And they need a voice.
I absolutely agree with the speaker earlier who said there are issues that we have to address around, well, you didn't use the word quality of life, did you? But around the care of our elderly and the kind of responsibility we carry for people who are older and are alone. And the issue of elder abuse was raised. Of course there are issues there that we must address as a society and we must address adequately. My bill will not address those, and nor was it decided to.
Hi, Mary. I just had a few questions about your bill, mostly with respect to what you said about the introduction of non-physicians actually having a role in this process. My kind of understanding was that you were looking to decriminalise actions on, say, a family member or an individual who wasn't actually a physician. I had a few questions about that, basically more to actually gain a further understanding rather than to actually pack it, obviously, for that. But what my questions were, basically, obviously, your main purpose of your bill in terms of having safeguards was that you actually had the introduction of two physicians providing an objective viewpoint on whether it was an appropriate decision or not. But I feel kind of by introducing family members into it, are you introducing a subjective element that may not necessarily be appropriate? That was one question. Also, with the situation of Sean here, obviously I feel that from his story that it was more of a last resort rather than something he actually wanted to do himself. And given that you have introduced the bill, obviously there will be a system in place there, a regulated system, whereby this is actually something that is a possibility, where it wasn't in Sean's situation for a physician to actually step in and perform that function. And basically my concern with that is, I can't speak for Sean, but I'm sure there's an element of torment that he has experienced with the act that he's actually had to do. Should we make it legal or decriminalise it for family members to actually get involved in something which might not necessarily be in their best interest in the long term if there's that possibility of a physician performing that function instead?
Thank you. Really good questions. Thank you very much. The appropriateness of introducing protections for family members. We have a living example here of the appropriateness of it. I am constantly told stories by surviving relatives of loved ones who chose not to hasten their own end or to get a family member to help them hasten their own death because of fear of the legal consequences for the family member. And so, without having a physician who was prepared to knowingly do what that person wanted them to do, and not being able to get a family member to help do it without potentially incriminating that family member, the person was, their only choice was to endure what they were finding unendurable. So I think there is...
Obviously you've experienced some stories and some situations which have had an effect on you. Sean is a good example. But I feel that those are situations that are happening within our current situation. Our current legal situation is that there's not a possibility to actually seek out a physician. So what I was saying is that if your bill was to come through, that would actually be a situation where there is alternatives. So actually having to ask a family member to do it wouldn't actually be a reality. So it's actually introducing something that isn't necessary.
Yeah, and yet there are people who would rather simply be surrounded by their loved ones, rather than a medical professional and loved ones. And again, it's about choices at the end of your life, and who you choose to share those final moments with. There are some jurisdictions where this is legal, which only allow for physicians to do this, and family members are kept out of it. They are not allowed to assist, do the final assisting. But there are others which have, I'm just trying to think of the Belgian or Dutch one, which require you to be able to self-administer. You must be able to administer the lethal dose yourself. Now, for somebody in the final stages of motor neuron disease, they could no more lift a cup to their mouth than fly to the moon. So there don't seem to be the choices that people who have talked to me about this issue are seeking in legislation here, learning from other jurisdictions. So it is possible that it could be physician only, but that's not always what people want.
I think that opens it up to real abuse, because you can never even test the decision, because the person who's able to give the evidence, in fact, is no longer alive. I think that really opens up huge legal problems. Except that it will have to have been tested and attested to as the person's own decision. So any family member assisting will have to be fully aware that all the preceding requirements will have to have been met. So there are safeguards. It doesn't open itself up, in my view, to wholesale abuse, because all the other safeguards will have to be met. The two consulting, and there are some safeguards I haven't even mentioned, like in the Netherlands, for example, there's a waiting period between the decisions. So they go back. In fact, there are 3 times the attesting physicians have to go back and ask the person, is this what you want? Do you understand? Do you realise what will happen? They're asked 3 questions, and they have to go back 3 times and get the person to say that each time. And there is a period of time in between, a legislated period of time in between each of those moments of asking. So whatever the process that we end up with, and certainly so far at the moment I'm looking at a time period that there will be checking and rechecking that this is still this person's decision, that will happen, and then if there is a lethal dose to be administered, then if a family member does it at that person's request, having met all these conditions and safeguards, that person is then not criminally liable. Thank you.
Question. I would like to ask a question that is probably directly to the Member of Parliament. I can only speak for myself, nobody else. I'm 84. From the time I was about 40 years old, I wrote in that I wanted to be in control of my own life as well as my own death. Every birthday, I looked at the same paper and altered 1 or 2 words that was more refined, until the stage now that I'm saying I have no problem at all of making up my own drink, particularly if I want a doctor, and I have my own straw and all the other stuff. But then there may come a time that I am going a little bit gaga, because that happens. Now, what is going to happen to me? All my life, wanted to do and take my own life, if I could say no longer white people, I used to say, or any other way couldn't look after himself. So then I, who is still me, have no longer the power to do this for myself. Will the bill look at my past wishes and desires so that I can then still be taken away the way I wish and dream I want to? And I believe that many people at that age that I am now are going through their mind, what will happen when I've gone gaga? I mean, I don't want to sit in an old home. I've been there, and you see them suffering, and you see them having a glass of water and everything else. Oh no, that's the worst thing I want. So what is going to be done to me? I'm selfish. What is that? Anyone of you can answer that?
Again, a great question, and I think epitomises some of the issues we've talked about tonight about autonomy and self-determination. And the bit of my bill that I hope will address the situation you're describing is the bit that relates to advanced directives, and that there should be legal recognition of advanced directives, but that they should be refreshed on a regular basis. That what you decided 5 years ago may not be relevant now. If you do it every birthday, that's fantastic. You're keeping it very up to date, sir, and that's great. But I would like those advanced directives not to be able to be overturned at a later date by relatives who didn't agree with you. Because again, that is depriving you of your right to determine your life and the length of it. So the provisions around advanced directives will be that they are legally binding, but they must be modern. They must be refreshed on a regular basis. And I'll put a period of time in, whether it's 5 years or 3 years or 2 years or something of that sort. So they have to be refreshed, and so that people can, on a regular basis, as sometimes we are reminded about doing our wills, refreshing our wills, then let's make sure that we've got up-to-date advanced directives as well.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind. I do it, and I even have them witnessed. Because I'm getting so uptight, I add up the amount of people that go overseas and have wars. I mean, I've been through the last war in the Netherlands, and it's not a nice thing. And we have mercenaries who we pay money, so they are professional murderers. And they come back again, they're going to call them soldiers, and they get a medal of it. I mean, this is such a degree of hypocrisy, it's just not funny. And here one of us, or 2 or 3, want to do voluntary euthanasia. Goodness gracious me, it's just hypocrisy.
So just a quick response to these. Advanced directives are already, valid advanced directives are already legally binding. We don't have the euthanasia law to make that happen. And I think it would be unfortunate if the whole notion of advanced directives and healthcare planning or living wills, whatever you want to call them, became tied in with the question of euthanasia. It's a very, very separate and very, very different thing. And there would be huge numbers of people who would not want to be euthanized as part of their advanced directives. So I think there could easily be some confusion around that.
Nothing in my bill would be compulsory. You would avail yourself of the bill should you wish to. It will not be a prescription.
Marianne, with respect to your legislation and your requirements, such as co-attending positions, I'd also like to say I agree with the distinction between legally and moral permissibility. I'm pro-euthanasia morally, but I'm not sure legally. One of the concerns I would have is two attending positions are attending in a confidential relationship. How do you propose to monitor whether or not coercion was involved? Or is this going to be a situation requiring a break of doctor-patient confidentiality?
Sorry,
and if I could just add one more thing to that. In light of the current abortion debate, abortion's long been, well, not long, but long in my lifetime been legalised in New Zealand. I'm sure you're probably aware of the current social debate around the fact that we've created, in some ways, a legal fiction, because most abortions are carried out under value of mental health damage to the mother. So yeah, I'd like to draw the parallel between that and the euthanasia requirement for 2 positions, and how would you plan to reconcile that?
Okay. Well, let me deal with the issue of the two physicians. The only parallel with the abortion issue is that no physician can be compelled to participate or to...
Do you think they would give appropriate weighting to the discussion with the patient, or the danger is that it would become a tick-box approach? Position one says, yeah, sure, you want to die, okay, tick the box. Goes and gets position 2, who just ticks it, and that would fulfill the requirement. How are you going to ensure that they give due consideration to the issue at hand, that they make an honest, actual decision? Are we going to require that maybe family members are also present, or perhaps a health and disability advocate? Because otherwise, the only eyewitness other than the physicians is dead afterwards. How are we going to check that this is in fact happening?
There are a number of issues in there. There may be occasions when you want family members absent, not present.
I agree.
In
For the
these sorts
sake
of
of the
discussions.
integrity of the decision, does someone else not need to witness it to be able to hold the positions to account?
Yeah, I think in these circumstances there would have to be 2 physicians who came to the same decision separately. We trust physicians hugely. Sometimes the trust is misplaced, but not often or typically. And I think physicians who agree to participate in this process are usually going to be people who have considered the ethics of the situation very closely, because it is not something that sits easily with people who have given their lives to healing.
Well, I've heard Grant we've all heard Grant talk about the problems between doctors and the medical profession, and there is an argument that says if we're going to entertain the legalisation of euthanasia or VAE, that we actually leave it to specialists who are not doctors. Might sound bizarre, but I think there was something to be said for that. The other couple of other quick things I want to say is that the 2-doctor system sounds really good, but doesn't actually meet what I would call the real world test in practice. It's not working in Oregon. There are a number of ways around that, and if my memory serves me correctly, the first celebrated case of assisted suicide in Oregon was by a woman who actually went doctor shopping. She was turned down by her own GP and another physician. At the moment, something like, don't quote me on the figures, but it's somewhere up around 8% of the physicians actually come through an organisation called Compassionate Choices, who are the organisation that lobby for active euthanasia. So it has no teeth. It is actually a farce. Anyone in Oregon who wants to get a position with the 2 physicians to sign it off can actually do that, and that has actually dropped, I believe, in Belgium. I could also quickly, just because you raised the example of the Abortion Act, I think another act which is a little bit closer to home that actually could serve as a real illustration of the difficulties of enacting law is the reform of the Liquor Act, or the liquor age. And at the time when it was being debated that the age had come down from 20 to 18, there was a lot of concern about the fact that 18-year-olds were already accessing liquor from the 20-year-olds by bringing it down to 18, 16, 15, 14 would. And in response to that, there was a lot of debate about it. In response to that, there were a whole lot of sort of things that were put in place. They're not working. So the intention and the motivation of lawmakers and what is written into the law, and there's others who could speak more about that, but what is written into the law doesn't always work. And I think that Sarah Bindley Act was a very, very good example of that. There was very few people would argue that that was, in hindsight, a good decision. So what's done in the debating chamber with the best of intentions and motivations often in practice doesn't make the real test, and I suggest that's the case with euthanasia.
Which is why the sale of liquor and the whole business around procurement and so on of alcohol has been revisited and is in the process of being revisited now by Parliament. And a provision that is in my legislation is that it be revised, be assessed within 5 years, or after 5 years of operation, then that it be evaluated.
Our time is just about gone, so perhaps we have the last question from
I'm not just directing my question directly to Mr. Kleinsman. Just wanting a bit of clarification. There was a lot of talk about the concern that the elderly would begin to feel like a burden and that would impact. But I'm also thinking about the concern that some elderly feel that they can't turn to their family and ask them to assist for fear that they will then be brought against charges of assisted suicide and face things such as home detention. And so if that is the case between those two concerns, does that mean that it is purely just down to a numbers game?
By numbers game, you mean?
Well, like whose concern wins out at the end of the day?
Yeah. I mean, there is a trade-off. One way or another, one group of businesses out. I mean, I think that's quite right. My argument would be that you're talking about a relatively small group of people who in the end want to carry that through that sort of decision making versus much larger numbers of people who are potentially vulnerable and open to abuse.
And to put it to the rest of the panel, is there, Mr. Kleinsman talked about an all or nothing thing. Does anyone believe that there's some kind of middle ground where both, or do you all support the all or nothing?
Perhaps, and just before the others comment on that, there's an argument now in Holland that it's actually there's a law which says it's actually you're discriminating against people if you actually deny them access to euthanasia on the basis of competency or anything like that. So I think that actually proves my point. But
it doesn't really, I mean, that's one way in which the law could be set up. It doesn't commit anybody necessarily to following that approach. But I mean, I'm a lawyer by training, which means I'm neurotically committed to things like consistency. It does seem to me that the concerns George raised are very real ones, and anybody who's seriously interested in the increasing choices at the end of life ought to be considering these questions. But as I suggested earlier on, they're not unique to this area. I'm not aware that anybody wants to revisit the situation whereby a Jehovah's Witness can refuse a blood transfusion, despite the fact that none of us can guarantee with 100% certainty that decision will not be the product to some extent of coercion or depression or a sense of duty. There's no way to make this 100% safe, but we don't require that level of safety with regard to other healthcare decisions. And it's just not entirely clear to me why we should be operating away from a level playing field here. These are real concerns. There are mechanisms that can be put in place to try our best to make sure that these are authentic, unpressured choices. If we're unsatisfied with those measures, then there's a whole bunch of stuff currently in the law books that we want to be revisiting.
It's very interesting listening to the debate here because we have different issues of focus in South Africa, but both countries are at the same stage of getting a law change, and Marion Street's already agreed to come and help us in South Africa. For instance, our panel of experts would not include family members. In New Zealand, you don't accept family members. We're seeking a law to make it illegal to coerce someone to commit suicide or assisted dying. Obviously, it requires detective work to find such a crime, but it would be a crime to do that. And other areas that are of different focus, for example, where you draw the line. We're drawing the line at terminally ill. Marion Street's bill goes a bit beyond that, easing suffering at the end. But in conclusion, I'd like to share a statistic with you that in countries where they have the option of legalised assisted dying, the number of attempted suicides by the elderly drops dramatically. In other words, when an elderly person knows they have that option, they end up having a natural death because they don't do anything about it. Yeah.
Just in response response to the question that was put to all the panel about whether we agree with the all or nothing proposition. It's either euthanasia voluntary or involuntary or nothing. I could not disagree more. I think it is entirely possible to have legal assisted suicide and for it not to become or turn into or morph in some way into legalised murder. So I could not disagree more.
Well, our time is up. We advertise this as a conversation we need to have, and I think it's a conversation that will continue. But I think you'll agree that we have needed to have this conversation tonight. Let me give some votes of thanks. My special thanks to my colleague, Professor Gavaghan, for organising tonight. Thanks to Jill Rutherford from the Centre for being very much behind this, and for our filming crew for persevering with us. Thank you very much to you all for attending and for engaging so well in tonight's issues. But a particular thanks to our 5 panellists for their insight.